Thank you, President Shukri, and I want to also reiterate our thanks to the sponsors. The sponsors also include a number of offices at York University, including the President's Office and also the Osgood Law School, that have been very generous in making this possible. They've bolstered the funds that we got from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council and the generosity of the two Trudeau Fellows, Isabella Backer and Janine Brody. And we are on a limited budget, but we've put together, I think, a really exciting event for you here. The event was conceived by a group of us. It was a team effort, and it was connected to precisely what President Shukri has just been mentioning, the mission of York University. And I'll give you my interpretation of this mission, since I've worked here for just a bit over 20 years. It's concerned with the development of knowledge, exploring the diverse ways to create a sustainable future built on self-actualizing local and global democratic communities. The event was conceived in light of those goals and in keeping with York's governance mission as a university with goals of engaged public debate based upon the principles of equity, equality, tolerance, and social justice. So I think we are consistent with that goal. And with respect to the question of public outreach, I wanted to tell you all that, in fact, the event today was formed in a threefold way. We developed a summer school, a graduate summer school on new constitutionalism and global governance. And following this event, we will have a high-level funded workshop funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council with eminent thinkers from across Canada and internationally, again, to go into more depth on these questions. That's by invitation only, but we'll be taking all of these projects forward, both to develop the capabilities for the future through training students, developing our research ideas, fostering the development of both younger scholars and mid-career scholars with senior figures like the ones that we have speaking on this panel. And it's a kind of a forward-looking project of creating a critical and progressive capability to address global challenges in the future. So with this consideration in mind, I wanted to tell you all that this event is being recorded. We will be publishing podcasts of this event, and you'll be able to access them in coming weeks. There will be a link placed. I have a personal website, www.stephengill.com, and you'll be able to link to that website and download the podcasts so that you can review the discussions in due course. With those considerations in mind, I've asked our speakers to develop a dialectical and critical perspective on the nature and future of global governance, because, in my view, global governance is ultimately connected to the primordial political relationship between rulers and ruled, that is, the power relations between dominant and subaltern or subordinated forces, in this case on a global scale, and the related question of how those forces envisage and try to shape the future. And we just had, as I told you, a number of sessions in our graduate summer school, and one of them was, one of our guests was Philip McMichael, who is a distinguished development theorist from Cornell University. And he told us that he's just finished the 6th edition of his book on development sociology. He asked himself the question, well, what should a 6th edition address? What question should it address? And he said, all of the 5 previous editions were really about improving on the past. But this edition, because we seem to have reached a kind of a turning point, is about managing or coping with the future. So I think this is the kind of agenda that I had in mind for today's session. So I've asked our speakers to address global governance in a dual perspective. And first of all, I've asked them to analyze global governance as it is. By this I mean the dominant projects of rule associated with the post-Cold War world order and the main governance mechanisms that stabilize, modify, and legitimate the global status quo. In this sense, global governance today involves devising durable methods, mechanisms, and institutions, including the use of organized violence, to help sustain an international order that is premised on the primacy of capital, the world market, and US power as the key governing forces of world politics. Often associated in more normative terms with discourses of good governance that you hear from the World Bank and the IMF, best practices. It's connected to concepts of limited government, self-regulation of business, as well as connected to a systemic use of surveillance and military power, including the practices of diplomacy, which is both a form of intelligence and surveillance, as well as, on the part of some countries, certainly, a mechanism of imperial intervention. The WikiLeaks cables that are released on a daily basis, the embassy cables, show precisely how some of this actually occurs. However, judged on its recent record, one must conclude that global governance as it really is has neither stabilized nor legitimated the existing order. And indeed, it may well be true to say that it's actually undermining the social well-being of a majority of people on the planet. That planet is characterized by increasing crises in health, food, and energy, increased exploitation of human beings and nature, the dispossession of livelihoods and the commons, and widespread ecological destruction. So at the same time, we've witnessed a deep crisis of accumulation in neoliberal capitalism, and it's placed this perspective in light of these other crises under growing scrutiny. So a second, more critical perspective brings power, political economy, ethics, and questions concerning the legitimate rule of law to the core of its analysis. It asks global governance of what, for whose benefit, and why. And such a critical perspective puts the question of the making of the future into that core of its considerations. It asks questions about feasible utopias and what ought to be, based upon what Gramsci called the pessimism of the intelligence, that is, a sober analysis of the constraints and challenges of the present world order in all its violence, in order to allow for an optimism of the will, that is, the idea that history is made and remade by collective action in ways that imagine feasible utopias and struggle to try to bring them about. Thus, a critical perspective on global governance involves not only the demystification of the power relations between leaders and led, but also assessment of the potentials for changes in those relations and consideration of how more progressive forms and mechanism of global governance can be actualized. Now, let me just say a few more words about our current global predicament as I read it. I think, as I said earlier, that the world has reached a critical juncture or turning point, which I call a situation of intensifying organic crisis. By that I mean a situation of multiple intersecting and deep structural crises, all of which challenge the proposition that global governance can continue to develop along its current trajectories, and an impasse that needs to be overcome. The organic crisis, or that is, the multiple crises that come together and form this organic crisis, are, of course, experienced very unequally, and they have effects that are racialized and gendered, and they are structured along lines of social class and caste as well. They involve the governance of the global political economy, of society, and of social reproduction. They involve questions of energy use, ecology, and sustainability, and they all raise fundamental questions about the legitimacy, ethical content, and the ethical content of current forms of global leadership and the social and political forces they purport to represent and defend. Issues over the use of military power, organized violence, and the legitimate use of force, as well as the deployment of states of emergency, also add to the range of questions that need to be raised. I'll give just one example because we're running a little bit behind time, and it concerns the failures of political leadership. It's particularly reflected in the climate change negotiations, about which Richard Falk has done a great deal of work, so you may want to discuss this in the question and answer session. I think the world's leaders have taken a giant step backwards in dealing with this problem at precisely the moment when the catastrophic trends associated with global warming are intensifying. And it's a problem that has quite a long lineage. For example, the first President, George Bush, made the statement in 1992 when he refused to attend the United Nations Rio Summit on the environment, "Our lifestyle is not negotiable." What he was referring to is the unsustainable, exploitative, fossil fuel-based, energy-intensive, wasteful, consumerist, and ecologically myopic lifestyles that are practiced in the United States and that have been increasingly emulated elsewhere, for example, in China. President Obama's negotiators, still reflecting the very same sets of US interests and lifestyles, managed at the summits in Copenhagen in 2009 and in Cancun in 2010 to forge a quote-unquote consensus that commitments to reduced carbon emissions targets should be entirely voluntary rather than binding, legally binding and constitutionally enforceable standards. By contrast, the Kyoto Protocol, which the United States signed but never ratified, at least had some binding mechanisms for those states that ratified, despite its over-reliance on market-based solutions. In what I prepared following, I have a text dealing with some aspects of global economic governance, but I will post this so that you can all read it later because I don't want to consume too much time. All I would say is that they relate to questions of dealing with the global economic crisis and downloading the costs of that crisis on the backs of unprotected and underrepresented and subordinated members of society, with the promise of, at least in the words of the recent head of the IMF, who had to unfortunately step down recently, there would be 10 to 20 years of austerity imposed upon the populations of the subject economies in order to pay for the costs of the bailout and build up a nest egg that would be able to have sufficient funds to bail out the global economy in the future when another crisis of the magnitude of the 2008 financial meltdown reemerged. So, not surprisingly, people resist the logic of this existing order. President Shukri has just mentioned his visit to Egypt. Richard Falk has also recently been in Egypt. And the developments there, although contradictory, show that people don't take things lying down. They also give cause for us to ponder the Orientalist argument that the masses in Arab countries are only capable of reacting to their oppression through religious fundamentalism and reactionary politics. Some of the values of the French Revolution seem to be at work in Egypt. There have been riots, and people are beginning to contest this agenda and its logic, which contains a commitment to an unsustainable future. So, there is a long agenda to address. We'll only be able to touch some of these issues today, but I'm pleased to say that we have an extraordinary group of speakers to address these issues from which I'm looking forward to hearing, and I think I will learn a lot, and I hope you will. I just want to, before introducing our two speakers for the first session, just outline one or two rules of procedure. Our speakers will present their ideas, and we'll then have a question and answer session of approximately 30 minutes. We have microphones here available for members of the audience to raise questions. Please keep your questions brief. Please use the microphones. If any of you have mobility issues and can't get to the microphones, please indicate that and we'll try and get a microphone to you. We are recording everything, so please speak clearly. And it would be very interesting to get your reactions to the ideas that are presented.